The sound of the gavel cracking against the wooden block echoed through the dusty auction hall, silencing the crowd of rough-faced men who had gathered in Redemption Creek, Colorado on that sweltering summer day in 1875. Francine Montgomery stood on the makeshift platform, her tattered blue dress hanging from her thin frame, wrists bound with coarse rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed floorboards, refusing to meet the hungry gazes of the men bidding on her future. "Next up, gentlemen," bellowed the auctioneer, a greasy-haired man named Silas Perkins, this fine specimen of womanhood. Been working as a maid back east, claims she can cook, clean, and keep a decent house. Starting bid at 50 cents. Francine bit her lip until she tasted blood. 3 weeks ago, she had been working in a Boston household, saving every penny for her dream of opening a millinery shop. Then her employer had accused her of stealing a silver brooch, a lie to cover his wife's gambling debts, and Francine found herself imprisoned, then shipped west on a prisoner train to be sold into servitude to pay for her supposed crimes. 50 cents, shouted a red-faced cattle baron from the front row. Skinny thing like that ain't worth more. 75, called another. $1, yelled a third, a man whose breath reeked of whiskey even from 10 feet away. Sitting at the back of the auction hall, Angus Donovan nursed a lukewarm beer, his weathered cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. He hadn't planned on attending the auction today. At 26, he'd been focused on expanding his small but promising cattle operation, not on acquiring labor or a wife. But something about the announcement that prisoners from back east would be auctioned had drawn him here, a memory, perhaps, of his own mother who'd once been treated as property before his father had freed and married her. The bidding for Francine continued, reaching $1.50 when Angus noticed something others seemed to miss. Behind her downcast eyes and the dirt on her face was a quiet dignity. Her shoulders, though slumped, weren't broken, and when she briefly glanced up, he caught a flash of intelligence and defiance that reminded him of the wild mustangs he sometimes tamed, spirited, not meant to be owned. $2, called the cattle baron, leering now. 3, countered the drunk, stumbling closer to the platform. Francine flinched almost imperceptibly when the drunk bid, and Angus saw fear flash across her face. He knew what fate awaited her with men like these. The so-called labor contracts were often just thinly veiled excuses for abuse. Before he realized what he was doing, Angus stood up. $20, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Silas Perkins blinked in surprise. $20 for the girl? Did I hear right? You heard me, Angus confirmed, walking toward the front. The crowd parted for him. Most knew Angus Donovan as a fair man, but one who didn't take kindly to being challenged. 21, said the cattle baron with a sneer. Angus reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He'd come to town to buy supplies, maybe a new rifle if he had enough left over. Instead, he dumped the contents onto the auctioneer's table. Coins clattered. A gold pocket watch his father had given him gleamed in the dusty light, and a deed to a small parcel of land he'd been saving to expand his grazing territory. I reckon that's about $43. The watch is worth another 20 at least, and that deed's for 10 acres of good grazing land near Clearwater Creek, Angus said calmly. That's everything I have, and she's priceless. The room fell silent. Even Francine looked up now, her blue eyes wide with shock as she stared at the tall cowboy with the sun-browned face and quiet voice. Silas Perkins quickly counted the money, examined the watch, and looked at the deed. Seems like the bidding is closed, gentlemen, he announced with a greedy smile. Sold to Mr. Donovan. Minutes later, Francine found herself walking down Redemption Creek's main street beside the cowboy who'd just spent everything he had to buy her. Her wrists were unbound now, but uncertainty kept her pace slow and hesitant. Why? She finally asked, her voice rusty from days of disuse. Angus looked down at her, his expression unreadable under the brim of his hat. No person should be sold like cattle, he said simply. My place is about 4 miles outside town. You can work there until you decide what you want to do next. I'll pay you fair wages, and when you've saved enough, you're free to go wherever you please. Francine stopped walking. You're not expecting anything from me? A flush crept up Angus's neck. Only honest work, Miss Montgomery. You'll have your own cabin on the property. I don't hold with treating people like property. For the first time in weeks, Francine felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. Thank you, Mr. Donovan, she said quietly. Angus, he corrected. Just Angus. The journey to Angus's ranch was mostly silent. He'd borrowed a wagon from the general store owner, promising to return it the next time he came to town. Francine sat beside him on the wooden bench, watching the town give way to rolling plains and distant mountains. It's beautiful, she whispered, almost to herself. Different from Boston, I expect, Angus replied. Francine nodded. I've never seen so much sky. As they crested a small hill, Angus's ranch came into view. It wasn't grand, a modest two-story cabin with a barn, corral, and a smaller cabin set about 50 yards from the main house. A small herd of cattle grazed in the distance. It's not much, Angus said, a hint of defensiveness in his voice. Built most of it myself after my parents passed 5 years back. It's lovely, Francine said sincerely. After weeks of prison cells and crowded trains, the open space and clean air felt like paradise. He showed her to the smaller cabin, which turned out to be a snug one-room structure with a small iron stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a chest of drawers. It's basic, Angus apologized. Used to be for ranch hands before I had to let them go last winter. Been running things alone since then. It's perfect, Francine assured him, stepping inside. I never expected such kindness from a stranger. Angus shifted uncomfortably. There's a pump out back for water. Outhouse is behind those trees. I'll bring you some supper in a bit. You should rest. After he left, Francine sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to cry for the first time since her arrest. Not tears of despair this time, but of relief and lingering fear. She had no idea what the future held, but at least she wasn't at the mercy of men who looked at her as nothing more than property to be used. That evening, true to his word, Angus brought a tray with a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. He'd also included a bar of soap, a towel, and a faded but clean cotton nightgown. Was my mother's, he explained gruffly when he saw her touching the nightgown. Might be big on you, but it's better than nothing until we can get you proper clothes. Francine wanted to thank him, but the kindness overwhelmed her after so much cruelty. Instead, she nodded, blinking back tears. Angus cleared his throat awkwardly. We'll figure out work tomorrow. Night, Miss Montgomery. Francine, she corrected softly. Just Francine. He nodded once, then left her alone with the first decent meal she'd had in weeks. The next morning, Francine woke at dawn, determined to prove her worth. She'd spent a restless night alternating between gratitude for her rescue and suspicion about Angus's true motives. No one spent everything they had without expecting something in return. Yet his eyes had held no calculation, no lurking desire. Just a straightforward decency that was more disarming than any charm. She found him in the barn, feeding 2 horses. He'd already milked the cow, and fresh eggs sat in a basket by the door. Good morning, she said, causing him to turn around quickly. I'd like to start earning my keep. Angus brushed hay from his hands. You don't need to start right away. You should rest. I've rested enough, Francine interrupted. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Donovan. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Angus, he reminded her, and I never thought you were afraid of work. Over breakfast in the main house, which Francine insisted on cooking, they established a division of labor. She would handle the cooking, cleaning, and garden, while he managed the cattle, repairs, and heavier work. He showed her the ledger where he'd started tracking her wages, a gesture that brought a lump to her throat. I'll need to go into town in a few days, Angus mentioned as they cleared the breakfast dishes. Get you some proper clothes and supplies. Francine hesitated. I'd rather not go back there so soon. Those men who were bidding. Angus's expression darkened. You don't have to go. I can get Mrs. Peterson at the general store to help select some things for a woman your size. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Francine threw herself into transforming both cabins from bachelor quarters into proper homes. She discovered Angus was meticulous about some things, his tools, his ledgers, the care of his animals, but oblivious to others, like the layer of dust on every surface and the sorry state of his wardrobe. For his part, Angus found himself looking forward to meals in a way he hadn't since his mother died. It wasn't just the improved cooking, though. Francine worked miracles with simple ingredients, but the company. He'd grown accustomed to silence, to talking to his horses more than to people. Now he found himself sharing stories of his day, listening to her tentative questions about ranching, and even explaining the history of the land. 2 weeks after her arrival, Angus returned from town with supplies including fabric, needles, thread, and a used sewing machine he'd traded for 2 calves. "Mrs. Peterson said you might prefer to make your own clothes rather than take ready-made," he explained awkwardly. "And I thought, well, you mentioned you wanted to open a hat shop someday." Francine stared at the sewing machine, then at Angus. "How did you remember that?" "I only mentioned it once." Angus looked away, suddenly interested in adjusting his hat. "Got a good memory for some things," he mumbled. That night, after Angus had retired to the main house, Francine sat beside the sewing machine, running her fingers over its polished surface. The thoughtfulness of the gift revealed more about Angus Donovan than any words could. He hadn't just been listening to her, he'd been hearing her. Summer gave way to early autumn, and with the changing season came a shift in their relationship. The initial awkwardness had faded into comfortable companionship. They still maintained separate quarters, still kept a proper distance, but shared meals had expanded to include evenings on the porch, Angus whittling or mending tack, while Francine sewed or read from one of the books from Angus's small collection. One evening in late September, a massive thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Francine had just finished washing the dinner dishes when the first lightning bolt split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The cabin's windows rattled, and she gasped despite herself. A knock at the door came moments later. Angus stood there, rain already soaking his shirt. "Storm's going to be bad," he said without preamble. "Your cabin roof still needs work. Better come to the main house until it passes." Francine gathered her shawl and hurried through the pelting rain alongside him. Inside his home, a fire blazed in the hearth, casting warm light across the simple but comfortable furniture. "I'll make some tea," she offered, moving toward the kitchen. "Already brewing," Angus replied. "Sit by the fire. You're shivering." Another lightning strike illuminated the room, and Francine jumped at the thunder that followed. Angus hesitated, then sat beside her on the small sofa. "Never liked storms much myself," he admitted. "My father used to say they were just the sky clearing its throat, but that didn't help when I was small." Francine smiled at the image. "What'd help?" "Stories," Angus said, his voice softening. "My mother would tell me tales about brave knights and clever princesses. Said fear couldn't live in the same place as good stories." "Would you tell me one?" Francine asked, then blushed at her boldness. Angus looked surprised, then pleased. "I'm not much of a storyteller, but I could try." As the storm raged outside, Angus told her about the first horse he'd ever tamed, a wild Mustang that everyone else had given up on. His voice, usually so practical and reserved, became animated as he described the months of patience it had taken to earn the animal's trust. "What happened to him?" Francine asked when the story ended. "Still have him," Angus said with a smile. "That's Thunder in the barn. 17 years old now, and still thinks he runs the place." "Like owner, like horse," Francine teased, then stopped, worried she'd overstepped. But Angus laughed, a rich sound she'd rarely heard before. "Reckon you're right about that." The rain continued through the night. Angus insisted Francine take his bed while he slept on the sofa downstairs. In the morning, they discovered that her cabin roof had indeed leaked badly, soaking her bed and many of her belongings. "You'll stay in the main house until I fix it," Angus declared, brooking no argument. "I'll sleep in the barn if need be." "Don't be ridiculous," Francine countered. "Your house has 2 bedrooms. I saw the second one upstairs. We're both adults, we can maintain propriety under one roof." Angus looked like he might argue, then nodded curtly. "If you're comfortable with that arrangement." The roof repairs took longer than expected, as autumn brought more frequent rains. Living in the main house meant more constant interaction, more moments of accidental closeness, hands brushing when passing dishes, catching each other's eyes across the room, the awareness of each other's presence in the quiet house at night. Francine found herself noticing things about Angus she hadn't before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how gentle his calloused hands could be when treating an injured calf, the deep timbre of his voice when he spoke softly. For his part, Angus discovered new facets of Francine daily. Her quiet determination had blossomed into confidence as she mastered ranch tasks. She'd started creating hats in her spare time, fashioning them from materials he brought from town, each one more beautiful than the last. And when she laughed a sound that came more frequently now, it transformed her from pretty to radiant. One crisp October morning, Angus prepared to ride into town for supplies. "Anything special you need?" he asked as Francine packed him food for the journey. She hesitated. "Actually, I'd like to come with you this time." Surprise registered on his face. "You sure?" "Those men who were at the auction." "It's been almost 3 months," Francine said firmly. "I can't hide forever. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I need to select some fabrics myself if I'm going to make a proper winter coat." The trip to town proved less daunting than Francine had feared. Redemption Creek looked different in the clear light of day, with families going about their business alongside the usual cowboys and miners. At the general store, Mrs. Peterson welcomed Francine warmly, clearly approving of her healthy appearance and the fine quality of the dress she'd made herself. "You've done well by her, Angus Donovan," the older woman said approvingly when Francine stepped away to examine bolts of wool. Angus shifted uncomfortably. "She's done well by herself, Mrs. Peterson. Strong woman." The shopkeeper hummed knowingly. "And when are you going to make an honest woman of her? Talk's already spreading about you two living out there alone." "It's not like that," Angus protested, though his ears had turned red. "She works for me, has her own cabin. For now," Mrs. Peterson said with a wink, leaving Angus flustered and thoughtful. Their visit to town was going smoothly until they stopped at the saloon for Angus to pick up some information about cattle prices from friends. Francine waited outside, admiring a display in the dressmaker's window across the street, when a shadow fell across her. "Well, look who's back in town," came a slurred voice. "The auction girl." Francine turned to find the drunk who had bid on her that day, his bloodshot eyes raking over her body. 2 equally unkempt companions flanked him. "Excuse me," she said firmly, attempting to step around them. "Not so fast," the man said, grabbing her arm. "Donovan overpaid for you that day. Wonder if he'd rent you out now that he's had his fun?" "Take your hand off me," Francine said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Or what?" The man sneered, tightening his grip. "Or I'll break it at the wrist," came Angus's cold voice from behind them. He stood in the saloon doorway, his normally gentle eyes hard as steel. The drunk released Francine, but didn't back down. "No need to get tetchy, Donovan. Just admiring your property. How much for an hour with her?" Angus moved so quickly that Francine barely saw it happen. One moment the drunk was leering. The next, he was on his knees, Angus's hand twisted in his collar, gasping for breath. "Miss Montgomery is not property," Angus said, each word precise and dangerous. "She is a lady deserving of respect. Apologize to her." "Now." The man choked out an apology, his friends backing away rapidly. "If you or anyone else ever speaks to her disrespectfully again," Angus continued in that same measured tone, "you'll answer to me." "Understood." When the man nodded frantically, Angus released him and turned to Francine. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice immediately gentle again. "No," she managed, though she was shaking slightly. "Thank you." The ride home was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. Francine kept replaying the incident, not the drunk's harassment, but Angus's response. The fierce protectiveness in his eyes had stirred something in her, something she was afraid to examine too closely. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Francine finally spoke. "What Mrs. Peterson said to you in the store today? About making an honest woman of me. People are talking, aren't they?" Angus nearly dropped the coffee cup he was holding. "You heard that?" "I have good hearing," she said with a small smile. "Is that why you defended me so forcefully today? Because of what people might think?" "No," Angus said firmly. "I defended you because you deserve defending. Because you're—" He trailed off, struggling for words. "Because I'm what?" Francine prompted softly. Angus set his cup down and turned to face her fully. "Because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Francine Montgomery. Because in 3 months, you've turned a house into a home. Because you face each day with courage that would put most men to shame. Francine's breath caught. Angus, let me finish, he said, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. I didn't rescue you that day at the auction. You would have found a way to survive no matter who bought your contract. But you've rescued me from a loneliness I didn't even know was killing me. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I don't care what people in town think, but I do care what you think. What you want. Francine looked at their joined hands, then up at his earnest face. When I first came here, all I wanted was to save enough money to leave, to start my shop somewhere far away from here, she admitted. But now, Angus prompted, hope and fear warring in his eyes. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else, Francine whispered, or with anyone else. The kiss that followed was tentative at first, as if each was afraid the other might disappear. Then Angus's arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer, and Francine's hands found their way to his shoulders, the solid strength of him anchoring her in the present moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Angus rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Francine Montgomery. Have almost since the beginning, I think. I love you too, she replied, the words both terrifying and freeing. But Angus, I need you to understand something. I won't be owned. Not by anyone, not ever again. I wouldn't have it any other way, he assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Partners, equal in everything. That's what I want. 2 weeks later, they were married in Redemption Creek's small church. Mrs. Peterson had insisted on helping with the wedding dress, though Francine had designed and sewn most of it herself. The entire town turned out, curious about the auction girl who had captured Angus Donovan's heart. The drunk and his friends were noticeably absent, having left town shortly after the confrontation, but the cattle baron who had bid that day approached the couple at the reception. Seems I undervalued the lady, he said gruffly to Angus. You were right that day. Priceless indeed. Francine, now Francine Donovan, squeezed her husband's hand. Some things can't be measured in dollars, she agreed, smiling up at Angus. That night, as husband and wife, they stood on the porch of their home looking out at the land that had brought them together. What are you thinking? Angus asked, his arms wrapped around her from behind, chin resting on her head. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best, Francine replied, leaning back against his chest. If I hadn't been falsely accused, if I hadn't been sent west, if I hadn't decided to go to that auction, Angus continued. We might never have found each other, Francine finished. It seems impossible, doesn't it, that in this vast country, with all its dangers and cruelties, we somehow found each other. Not impossible, Angus murmured, turning her to face him. Meant to be. As winter settled over the Colorado plains, Angus and Francine settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. The second bedroom upstairs was slowly transformed into a workspace for Francine's millinery business, which had begun to attract customers from town. Mrs. Peterson had been the first to purchase one of her hats, and word spread quickly about the talented Mrs. Donovan. Angus expanded his cattle operation, hiring 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Francine's head for numbers complementing Angus's practical knowledge of the land and animals. By spring, they had saved enough to buy the adjacent property, doubling the size of their ranch. And when summer came again, almost a year after Francine had stood trembling on that auction block, she shared news that made Angus whoop with joy loud enough to startle the cattle. They would be welcoming a child by Christmas. On a warm evening in June, they sat on their porch swing, watching fireflies dance over the fields. Francine's sewing lay forgotten in her lap as Angus read aloud from a book of poetry he'd ordered from Denver. Do you ever regret it? Francine asked suddenly. Spending everything you had that day? Angus closed the book, considering her question seriously, as was his way. Not for a single moment, he finally said. Best investment I ever made. Francine laughed and swatted his arm. I was being serious. So was I, Angus insisted, pulling her closer. Look at what we've built together, Francine. This home, this life, our future. His hand rested gently on her still flat stomach. How could I regret the choice that brought me everything I never knew I wanted? Francine leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. From property to partner, From auction block to cherished wife, her journey had been unlikely and extraordinary. But here, in the arms of the man who had seen her value when others saw only her price, she had found not just safety, but purpose. Not just refuge, but love. You know, she said thoughtfully, I used to dream of escaping west, of building a new life far from Boston. I never imagined it would happen like this, but now I can't imagine it happening any other way. Angus pressed a kiss to her forehead. That auction gavel was the luckiest sound I ever heard, he murmured. Brought me the woman worth every penny I had and more. And brought me the man who saw I was priceless, Francine whispered back, lifting her face for a proper kiss as the first stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky.